You have probably seen them before, a crowded medieval panel where grotesque demons tug at a sinner's flesh, a bestseller or film that strings together crimes as if following an ancient moral menu, a friend scrolling past picture after picture, eyes flicking between desire and resentment. The 7 deadly sins are everywhere in our visual culture and in our language, but they are not a fixed, timeless inventory tucked neatly into the Bible. They are a bundle of ideas that traveled through centuries, changed shape, and now keep showing up in new guises. How the 7 deadly sins shape our lives today is a story about translation, pedagogy, art, and the ways moral categories steer attention, justify policies, and even organize entertainment. Historically, the 7 are a constructed heuristic. They began as loose lists of vices and tendencies drawn from Greco-Roman ethical thought and Jewish wisdom literature, were honed into a monastic diagnostic by figures like Evagrius Ponticus, reshaped in Latin Christian practice by John Cassian and Pope Gregory I, and finally systematized by Thomas Aquinas. Along the way, Dante's Purgatory and painters such as Hieronymus Bosch gave vivid images to these abstract categories, and the modern imagination inherited those pictures. But those same categories, pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust, did not simply die with the medieval monks. They became tools, labels that help societies name certain disorders of desire, and that guide how we teach children, shape laws, design media, and even run marketing campaigns. They frame how individuals interpret their impulses and how institutions diagnose social ills. If this kind of cultural history interests you, stick around and consider subscribing. There's a lot to unpack. Look around culture and you will see the same motifs. Artists borrow the visual shorthand of vice, filmmakers set up crimes as embodiments of a single passion, and public rhetoric borrows the old language to dramatize contemporary problems. A Bosch painting turns into a thumbnail for a video about modern corruption. A line from Dante is adapted into a TV episode structure. Journalists speak of gluttonous corporations or prideful political leaders. Part of what makes these categories enduring is that they work on several levels at once, as moral instruction, as psychological diagnosis, as rhetorical accusation, and as evocative imagery. The story that follows traces where these categories came from and, crucially, how each one has migrated into modern life. The antecedents matter. Long before medieval monks cataloged vices, Greek and Roman writers were naming human errors in ways that would later resonate with Christian moralists. Aristotle's ethics concerned the excesses and deficiencies of character. Cicero and other Roman writers listed vices as impediments to civic virtue, and poets like Horace offered moralizing portraits of appetite and ambition. These classical lists were not identical to the later 7, but they established the intellectual habit of grouping certain recurring patterns of desire and behavior. Meanwhile, Jewish sapiential writings, texts of wisdom and ethical exhortation, contained catalogues of wrongdoings and spirits that also shaped the moral imagination of late antiquity. For example, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs includes a list of spirits or vices that resemble later medieval enumerations, suggesting that the impulse to name clusters of moral failings is cross-cultural and long-standing. It is in the monastic context, however, that the list begins to crystallize in a way that directly feeds the later Christian tradition. Evagrius Ponticus, a 4th-century monastic thinker who lived in the Egyptian desert, offered a technical and psychological account of interior struggles. He spoke of 8 logismoi, sometimes translated as evil thoughts or temptations, which included gluttony, fornication, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, vainglory, and pride. The Greek term acedia or acedia, often Latinized as acedia, is worth pausing over. In Evagrius, it names a specific monastic diagnosis, a kind of spiritual listlessness or despondency that afflicts monks in their cells, a restlessness that can be both boredom and existential despair. Translating it simply as sloth flattens the nuance. Scholars debate the exact contours of the term, and older Latin traditions sometimes rendered it as tristitia, sadness, or acedia. The practical point is that Evagrius's list functioned as a clinical manual for interior life. Monks were to recognize, name, and treat these inner disorders. John Cassian, writing from the West in the 5th century, imported and adapted Evagrius's insights for a Latin Christian audience.
Cassian also described 8 principal vices, but the shape of the list shifted as his text circulated. Pope Gregory I, in a late 6th century pastoral handbook, famously consolidated these vices. He presented them as the 7 that would become canonical in the medieval imagination. Gregory's maneuver involved combining or reclassifying some items. He merged vainglory with pride, for example, and reworked tristitia and acedia in ways that reflected pastoral concerns, not merely monastic taxonomy. By the time Thomas Aquinas wrote his Summa Theologiae in the 13th century, the 7 had been more firmly articulated and were given a metaphysical logic. Aquinas described pride, superbia, as the caput, the head sin, from which other vices flow. He used philosophical categories to explain how certain passions could be ordered under more fundamental disorders of love or reason. Yet even Aquinas acknowledged that these were tools for moral discernment, not a direct extract from Scripture itself. Translation and transmission introduce another layer of complexity. Latin and Greek technical terms did not always map cleanly onto each other.
A term like vangloria in medieval Latin raises questions. Is it merely vainglory in our sense, or does it carry a slightly different semantic field? Is tristitia simply sadness, or a pathological melancholy? Manuscript variants and the movement of texts across languages result in instability. Sometimes medieval lists have 8 items, sometimes 7. Sometimes different communities chose substitute vices based on their own concerns. Dante Alighieri, writing poetically in the 14th century, organized purgatory around 7 terraces, each purging a particular vice. Dante's poetic ordering gave the list a narrative and imagistic power, souls climbing a mountain, each level refining a habit with symbolic punishments and purifications. Dante's structure helped popularize and fix the list visually and narratively, even as scholastic debates about categories continued. Artists and theologians added another interpretive layer by mapping sins onto demonology. Medieval commentators often paired vices with particular demonic figures, Belial, Asmodeus, Lucifer, and others, creating a vivid cosmic drama in which personal disorder had spiritual proxies. These mappings were interpretive devices. They dramatized moral struggle and offered moral pedagogy through narrative. Paintings by Bosch, with their hybrid monsters and nightmarish scenes, provided an enduring visual vocabulary. Bosch's grotesques did not merely illustrate a list, they invited viewers to feel the visceral horror and absurdity of vice. That imagery migrated into modern culture, where filmmakers and novelists used the 7 as a structural device. David Fincher's Seven is an obvious example, where each crime stages a sin, but the cinematic reuse shows how the 7 can function as narrative scaffolding long after the theological debates have faded from view. Understanding the technical terms matters when we try to map these ancient categories onto contemporary phenomena. Acedia, Greek acedia, Latin acedia, as noted, is more than laziness. It names disaffection, apathy, existential boredom that undermines care. Tristitia, sometimes translated as sadness or melancholy, overlaps with acedia in some texts and is distinct in others. Superbia, pride, is not merely vanity. In scholastic usage, it connotes an inordinate ordering of self-love above proper love for God or neighbor. Envy, invidia, is not mere covetousness. It often implies rejoicing in another's misfortune. Avarity, avaritia, concerns the disordered pursuit of possessions, while gluttony, gula, indexes excessive appetite, not necessary consumption. Ira, wrath, can be a righteous impulse gone violent or vengeful, and luxuria, luxury, lust, historically encompassed a range of sexual excesses and misuses of desire. Scholars differ on exact translations and overlaps, so any contemporary application must be interpretive rather than definitive. So how do these categories shape life today? They operate on several registers at once. First, as shorthand in public discourse, politicians, commentators, and activists borrow the language of the sins to frame social phenomena: corporate greed, consumer gluttony, online envy, packaging complex structural issues into intuitively moral terms. Second, as pedagogical tools, schools, families, and religious institutions still use lists of vices and virtues to teach conduct. Third, as psychological heuristics, individuals use these categories to understand and name their own impulses. I'm feeling envy, or I need to fight pride, which structures self-reflection and remediation. Fourth, as narrative and aesthetic devices, the arts and media use the 7 to organize stories, creating patterns that shape audience perception. Consider pride, or superbia.
Aquinas' claim that pride is the head sin persists in how we talk about leadership and identity. Today, pride often appears in secular language as the inflated self-regard of celebrities, politicians, or influencers who seem to live for status alone. But pride also morphs into identity politics or corporate branding, when a company's image or a political movement centers self-exaltation to the exclusion of communal goods. Critics, whether religious or secular, invoke pride as shorthand for a self-congratulatory hierarchy. The ancient worry that pride distorts love and proper ordering maps onto modern concerns about performative status and the social architecture built to reward visibility. Envy, or invidia, is perhaps the most recognizable in the age of social media. Platforms designed to encourage comparison make it easy to fixate on others' curated lives, converting simple longing into resentful comparison. Where Dante might have imagined envy as a soul pinioned in bitterness, the contemporary scene is an algorithmic one. Envy spreads not just through conversation, but through feeds that measure likes and followers. Envy operates not only as private sorrow, but as public rhetoric, shaping movements of resentment or aspirational consumerism. Wrath, ira, has a contemporary face in polarized politics and online outrage. The ancient moral concern was about disordered anger that seeks revenge rather than justice. Today, digital mobs can transform righteous indignation into punitive spectacle. Governments and media amplify wrath, often for attention or profit. The speed and scale of modern communication means anger can be mobilized quickly and without deliberation, an echo of the medieval worry that anger bypasses reason. Sloth, acedia, shows up in surprising ways. In monastic texts, it described spiritual torpor. In modern life, it can manifest as burnout, disengagement, or apathy disguised as exhaustion. In a culture that valorizes productivity, sloth sometimes appears as a refusal to participate, but much more often it is an exhausted withdrawal caused by systemic stresses.
The contemporary phenomenon of doom scrolling, endless passive consumption of distressing news, resembles acedia, a restless, listless engagement that numbs rather than heals. Recognizing the nuance here matters. Calling someone lazy flattens the moral and social complexities that fuel disengagement. Avarice and gluttony both take new shapes under late capitalism. Avarice, avaritia, shows not simply in corrupt financiers, but in structural incentives that prioritize accumulation over care. When economic systems reward extraction and short-term gain, avarice is not merely an individual's moral failing, but an institutional logic. Gluttony, gula, moves beyond the table to describe binge culture, the endless consumption of streaming content, fast fashion purchases, and food industries engineered to promote excess. Designers of platforms and products exploit appetites in ways that blur individual culpability and systemic design. Lust, luxuria, has been transformed by technology and markets. The commodification of sexual imagery, the prevalence of hookup culture, and a vast pornography industry turn desire into a product. The theological horror once reserved for private sin has become a public debate about consent, commodification, and the ethics of desire. The ancient diagnostic language about desire misdirected helps us ask whether the market structures surrounding sex and intimacy exacerbate harm, objectification, and detachment, or merely reflect long-standing human behaviors refracted through new media. These mappings are not deterministic claims. These sins do not mechanically cause social ills. Rather, the categories help explain how certain patterns of feeling and behavior are named, visible, and addressed in public life. Calling corporate behavior avarice frames it as moral failing. Calling it structural incentive shifts the focus to institutions. Both frames are useful in different ways. Part of the modern power of the seven lies in their rhetorical flexibility. They can name an individual's inner disorder or dramatize systemic vice. The seven also shape education and moral pedagogy. Many schools and religious curricula still employ versions of virtue ethics that arise from these lists. Teaching children to temper envy or to cultivate humility is not merely antiquarian. Such instruction participates in forming citizens who can manage rivalry, cooperate, and regulate desire. At the same time, invoking sins to shame or stigmatize can be counterproductive. Modern educators and chaplains wrestle with how to adapt these ancient categories in psychologically informed ways that avoid moral trauma. In the arts, the seven are potent narrative devices. That is why films, novels, and TV series revisit them.
They provide ready-made motives for characters and a dramaturgy that audiences intuitively grasp. When a story distributes vices among characters, it invites the audience to see patterns, to diagnose social types, and to enjoy the moral puzzle.
Visual culture, inheriting Bosch's grotesques and Dante's ordered purgatory, continues to use vivid imagery to make vice legible. Advertising often flips the moral script, depicting the indulgence of gluttony as pleasure and reframing avarice as savvy investment. Here, the rhetorical power of the seven meets market persuasion. There is also a political dimension. Accusations that a political opponent is prideful or avaricious are not neutral. They aim to delegitimize by locating the adversary within a tradition of vice. Conversely, activists sometimes reclaim the language, talking about corporate gluttony or political wrath to mobilize action. The seven become a repertoire for moral rhetoric, enabling both condemnation and critique. If there is a unifying lesson, it is this: the seven deadly sins operate less like a dogmatic truth and more like a set of lenses. They help people notice particular disorders of desire and help societies create narratives about fault and remedy. They can name personal struggles, justify public policy, supply storytelling structures, and animate moral pedagogy. Because these categories are historically contingent and often fuzzy in translation, using them responsibly requires nuance. Acknowledging their origins, the debates around words like acedia and tristitia, and the ways institutional structures shape what looks like sin. So, how might we respond, practically and reflectively, to the fact that these categories still shape our lives? One approach is diagnostic humility. Treat the language of the seven as a starting point for understanding, rather than a final verdict. When you feel corrosive envy or an urge toward excess, ask whether you are confronting a personal failing, a social structure that encourages such behavior, or both. Another is pedagogical creativity. Adapt these categories to contemporary realities without reverting to shame as the primary tool. Teaching about online envy, for instance, might include technical literacy, mental health strategies, and communal practices that counter comparison. A third approach is artistic, recognizing how powerful images, Bosch's hybrids or Dante's mountain, still move audiences and can be used to provoke reflection rather than merely to punish. Finally, remember that scholars debate the history. Some see neat continuity from Evabrius to Aquinas. Others emphasize discontinuities and local variations. Manuscript transmission, translation choices, and pastoral needs shaped the list as much as abstract theology did. The result is a cultural toolbox rather than a monolithic doctrine. Which of these patterns do you notice most in your life or in the culture around you? Envy on social feeds, the wrath of cable news, the gluttonous supply of content, or some other tendency? Share your experience in the comments. If you're curious about the sources and want to read further, check the description for a short bibliography that includes primary texts and accessible modern scholarship. If this exploration of moral history and contemporary life appealed to you, consider subscribing for more episodes that trace how ancient ideas travel into the present. Thank you for listening. Notice the categories that shape the stories you are told, and consider how naming them might change the way you act, teach, or tell stories.